So you want to score study a piece. Maybe you're performing the work soon. Maybe you've just heard about it from a lot of different people and want to see what it's all about. Or maybe you just really like the piece and you want to know what makes it the way it is. Regardless of your reasons for wanting to score study a piece, there are a number of different approaches, and each one is a little bit different in terms of what it actually gives to the person studying. Let me paint you a scenario. You've become under the impression, either through school or online forums, or maybe even friends and colleagues, that the Fourth Symphony of Johannes Brahms is essential to symphonic literature and music as we know it, and any composer worth their salt will have a deep and intimate understanding of this piece. Oh shit, you think to yourself. I've never even heard Brahms's Fourth Symphony. How can I claim to be a musician without this familiarity that I've come to understand is essential? As soon as I get home, I'm going to score study Brahms's Fourth Symphony without any particular score study strategy in mind, and I will have redeemed myself. Okay, cool. Nothing wrong with Brahms's Fourth Symphony, and it never hurts to learn a new piece, right? So you get home, you grab your score of the Brahms symphonies, or download it from IMSLP, and you put on a recording on YouTube and read straight through the score. 40 minutes later, I've learned nothing. This was so often my experience when discovering the world of European classical music, and eventually I just stopped score studying until college when it became a necessity because I felt that I gained literally nothing from it. I could read through Debussy scores all day and I would have no more knowledge of Debussy's composition techniques and how I could emulate them than I did before. And all of this comes down to not knowing how to approach score study. The problem with just reading through things over and over and expecting results is that since you have no particular goals in mind other than just general familiarity, you're not actually really internalizing anything. In fact, if your goal is familiarity, then just listen to the piece. You're distracting yourself from the internalization by focusing on reading. Now, this issue of course goes away with the more experience you have, but if you're generally new to score study and or you have trouble focusing on things, by the way, check out my ADHD and composition video, it's been my experience that listening to a work does a lot more for the internalization of it than reading does, at least at first. So how do you score study then? What are better approaches to take that'll be more efficient? I'm so glad I asked. First, let me take you through my process when I'm approaching a piece that I've either never heard or just have a really low level of familiarity with. First thing I do is listen to the piece at least twice, and ideally with different recordings. The majority of the time I do this without looking at a single note of the score, and this is to, as my former conducting professor would put it, know how the song goes. The next step entirely depends on what my intent is. If this is a piece that I'm going to conduct, then I'm going to go through with some colored pencils and mark up all the time changes, all of the entrances, dynamic and expression markings, things like that. Then I'll listen to the piece with my marked up score in front of me and sort of shadow conduct to different recordings. And after hours of this type of thing, as well as some musical decision making, I will try and wean myself off the score in an attempt to have the whole thing memorized. If I'm studying a score in an attempt to learn from the composer, I'll do one of two things. If after a number of different listens through the work, I'm not really taken by the majority of the piece, but rather a few select moments, I will zoom in on those moments that struck me and try and learn everything I possibly can about those specific moments, and then just leave the rest of it be. I don't want to spend a lot of time studying music that I'm more or less apathetic to. Alternatively, if the work leaves an overall really positive impression on me, then I will just continuously listen through the whole thing with a pencil and circle or mark up the things that I notice. This requires a lot of pausing so that I can make observations. These observations can often be the most mundane of things, but they're often things that I wouldn't have noticed when listening to the recording and are only revealed when reading the score. By circling and writing little notes about different things throughout the course of the score, I'm splitting up my work and allowing myself to zoom in on different things in future readings and listenings of the piece. This way, as I continue to listen to and study the piece, I'm not just staring blankly at 18 staves trying to take in everything I possibly can, but I'm actually able to read the score with intent and really try and understand my observations. An example of this might be a really striking harmonic progression. I'll take the time to figure out exactly what that harmonic progression is without feeling the pressure to do that for the entire piece. Another example might be figuring out certain orchestral textures. So many times I've heard pieces where a certain combination of instruments just grips me and I have to go find a score to figure out what exactly is going on. Even if it's just a moment in time, I have learned something from it, and it doesn't make me feel the pressure to investigate the entire score unless I want to. It's also interesting to read through the score and focus on the things that I haven't circled or found noteworthy. That can often be just as informative. So those are what my most common score study processes are. But instead of trying to follow exactly what I do, let's take a look at the broader principles that that led me to these processes so that you can have an easier time figuring out what works for you. The reason my processes work for me is because I have specific goals in mind, and they're divided up in such a way that they are, get this, measurable and attainable. My first step is listening to the piece. That's really easy, and there's nothing complicated about it. If I really enjoy the piece, then I can go through the score and circle things so I can figure out what makes me enjoy it so much. It's another step that's centered around dividing up the learning process so that it's very specific. There are certain things, however, that my explicit example of my process doesn't work well for. For example, it doesn't lend itself well to understanding the large-scale structure of a piece. But if that's what you want to learn about the piece, then you can start your score study with that specific goal in mind. Or maybe you want to explore the ways in which a composer develops a theme or motif throughout the course of a piece. The processes that I usually use don't work well for that, but it's another example of something that's specific that you can go after in your score study. So while no one procedure of score study is going to work well for every single musical element that you want to explore, they all have in common that you can base them on specific goals. And then once you have a goal in mind, you can then continue to design your process in a more detailed way, like my circling and writing about things that I notice. I learn a lot through the way that I score study, but there are a few things that I think composers should consider with what they want to get out of score study. The first thing is obvious, learning about the musical elements of a work, melody, harmony, counterpoint, orchestration, whatever else. The second thing is learning about the specific moments that the composer listening finds really impactful. These moments can just be a single bar in a whole work, but if it's something that really moved you and you thought was really, really cool, you should investigate it and learn everything about it that you can. And then the third thing I think composers should consider in trying to get out of score study is general familiarity, or again, knowing how the song goes. Having a lot of music really well internalized is a really powerful thing for a composer. The final thing I want to talk about is how you decide what music you're going to score study. At the beginning of the video, I created a hyperbolized scenario of a composer thinking that they needed to study a certain piece because of what society values, I guess. Again, it was a hyperbolized scenario, but the actual situation is not too uncommon. After all, how should a composer know what to listen to without anyone else to guide them? It's definitely worth giving all sorts of music at least a chance, but if there's some wildly popular piece that you just can't get into, it's okay to leave it alone. I used Brahms as an example because I, with some exceptions, have a really difficult time getting into early to mid-romantic European music. I don't generally identify with that era in music, and so I don't often study music that came from that time and place. That does not mean, however, that there's nothing to be learned from that music, so I don't think there's any one thing that should be entirely ignored, even if it isn't really your thing. And if it's something that society seems to value, at the very least, even a low level of familiarity will give you something to talk about at parties.
So what do you think of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony? Greatest piece of all time, right?
Oh, no, yeah, definitely. Yeah. The way that it has 4 movements.
Yeah, and the way that in the recapitulation of the first movement at measure 301, or rehearsal letter K if you have the Bärenreiter edition, he uses a low F sharp in the double basses to thwart the earlier home key of D minor, so that it's a D major chord instead. But since it's in first inversion, it feels still really apocalyptic and unstable.
Yeah. And it's, Beethoven used a lot of time signatures in his music.
So this is all to say that I think it's a good idea to try and score study a range of different music from different times and different places. But try prioritizing studying the music that you enjoy, because as a composer, that's what you're going to get the most out of, and it's going to help you develop your unique voice. So today, what I want to know is what pieces you're interested in score studying, and if applicable, what pieces you've already studied that have left a big impact on you. I want to hear all about it, so go down to the comments and let me know. And I'll start us off. A couple of the pieces that have enormously influenced me are Claude Debussy's La Mer and Samuel Barber and William Grant Still's First Symphonies, as well as some of the smaller scale pieces that I got to perform in college, like the Rebecca Clark Viola Sonata and Adolphus Hailstork's Sanctum. And this is to say nothing of the disproportionate amount of Mahler and Shostakovich I listened to. Thanks so much for watching. Leave a like on the video and consider subscribing if you found it useful or interesting, and I will see you soon.